This forest is a shrubby wet sclerophyll forest dominated by bluegum. Tall, emergent, smooth-barked bluegums with a fairly dense subcanopy of rainforest species, and quite a diversity of rainforest species here. A lot of them have characteristics that mean that they're relatively tolerant of fire. They're a bit of an edge dweller, some of them. Species like the tree heath and scentless rosewood and rose maple, some of the native laurels can tolerate some fire. On the ground, not a huge covering of grasses, simply because there's quite a dense subcanopy of rainforest species, and they tend to shade out a lot of the classic ground covers, of grasses and forbs and other ground covers. In areas where there might be gaps in the rainforest subcanopy, there'll be grasses, grassy patches. The distinguishing features of shrubby wet sclerophyll forests are the tall, emergent, almost statuesque eucalypts below a shrubby subcanopy, generally made up of a dense diversity of rainforest species, particularly here on the Dorrigo Plateau. This is a classic structure and appearance of a shrubby wet sclerophyll forest. The shrubby layer is mostly composed of rainforest species, but there are also species such as the Zairias or the stink bushes, let me see what else we got. We've got some vines, we've got some wombat berries and climbing guinea flower. They're all species that aren't classically regarded as rainforest species. Interestingly, the stink bush has a really high concentration of oil in its leaves, and there's a lot of quite valuable essential oils in it. Very flammable when fire does come along. So within the shrubby wet sclerophyll forests of the Dorrigo Plateau, probably one of the most common, if not the most common, is the Sydney bluegum, also just called the bluegum. So very tall emergent trees. Tallowood, which is a rough-barked eucalypt, we'll probably see some a little bit further down the track, is another classic canopy tree in the shrubby wet sclerophyll forests, and brush box, of which there's some smaller brush boxes just in behind us. They're the three most classic shrubby wet sclerophyll forest trees. A great diversity of native fauna species depend upon the shrubby wet sclerophyll forests. Because the bluegums and the other eucalypts create large hollows, there are an awful lot of possums, owls, gliders, snakes and lizards that live within these forests. Within the understory, so these dense shrubby understories are really good homes for some quite rare macropods or kangaroos and wallabies. So the Palmer wallaby, they are around here, but they're very secretive. They're quite quick and a small dark wallaby. Two different types of paddy melons that live in the understory. So the red-legged and the red-necked paddy melon, and they're also in pure areas of rainforest. There are, in areas once again with really dense understory, there are long-nosed potoroos, which is a little tiny digging wallaby, which is incredibly rare and threatened. There are a large number of snakes, including tiger snakes and red-bellied black snakes, Stevens banded snakes, which actually live up in the hollows and very rarely come down on the ground. The rough-scaled snake is another classic snake in the understory of these forests. There's a host of lizards, including a whole lot of quite large skinks and monitors and a couple of different types of dragons. So the water dragon and the southern angle-headed dragon, which is quite a secretive and very quiet but colourful dragon, which clings on rainforest trunks, and there's good numbers of them in these forests, although you very, very rarely see them. Interestingly, there's the occasional coast banksia. There's some bigger ones over here further in the forest. Amazing little creature, the eastern pygmy possum, feeds upon the flowers of the Banksia, and there have been quite a number seen here at Mount Highland over the years. In the north of New South Wales, they're basically only right up on top of the Great Dividing Range, whereas you go further south and they're also down into the coastal lowlands. So a real host of fauna live in these amazing forests, and a lot of them are rare and restricted to these very magnificent forests. There's a few different sorts of shrubby wet sclerophyll forest on the Dorrigo Plateau. Closer over to the coast, areas with flooded gum and tallowood and brush box are what you'd call your north coast wet sclerophyll forest, so down on the lower elevation areas. And then there's a few different types of shrubby wet sclerophyll forest that are upon a gradient going higher and higher up into the tablelands. And as you get higher and higher, the dominant eucalypts change. So as you get to kind of the mid altitude, there's the New England blackbutt is a classic tree species in the shrubby wet sclerophyll forests. As you get higher still, species like mesmate and mountain gum come into the equation, often well over 1,000 metres, and they're all different classes or different types of shrubby wet sclerophyll forests. So altitude is the classic factor that determines where they are, and often it's not immediately obvious exactly where you are. So there's ecotones or blurring of the lines, so mixtures of different forest types, and certainly the forests that we're in are very mixed, and it can sometimes be very hard to say precisely what forest type you're in. And for landholders and people who might not have experience in working in forests, it can be a bit tricky trying to actually understand and communicate the types of forests that are under their management. So, you know, you can take quite a lateral interpretation of some of these forests, quite a broad interpretation. In the absence of fire, these tall, wet eucalypt forests are highly likely to shift over many centuries to rainforest. And there are definitely sites around here at Mount Highland where fire hasn't happened in centuries, and there'll be, in the middle of an expanse of rainforest, there'll be one or two remaining giant old growth eucalypts. So fire is an important process for triggering the germination and the recruitment, the regeneration of eucalypts. In the absence of fire, as I'd mentioned before, rainforest will ultimately take over. And if the whole landscape were to become rainforest, there would be a loss of important fauna habitat values. So particularly in the tall eucalypt forests, and looking up at this blue gum here now, and on the left hand side of the fork, there's actually quite a lovely smooth hollow up there. That's probably, and even on the right hand fork, an even bigger one where there's a dead tube now. That's not a gigantic blue gum, but it's a reasonable sized blue gum. In the absence of fire, if rainforest came in and the blue gum died, there's a whole lot of fauna that simply couldn't exist in this landscape. So there's a need for a dynamism in the forest and a patchiness to make sure that there are patches with hollows and patches with rainforest, because a lot of the fauna will feed within rainforest. They'll feed on nectar, pollen and fruit within rainforest, but then they'll live in the tree hollows that immediately adjoin the pure rainforest areas. So fire does have a very important role to play over many decades and centuries in maintaining that diversity in the landscape. But the big problem is that all the forests on the Dorrigo Plateau are remnants of previously much more extensive forests. And managing fire and having fire in a fragmented landscape is a lot harder. And because of that, in recent years at any rate, there have been some really large, high intensity and very broad scale fires, and there's been a huge loss of important fauna habitat values in places such as Chalundi, where a lot of hollow-bearing trees have fallen, and a lot of these really sensitive native fauna species have lost their habitat. And it will take many generations, so decades through to centuries, for those hollow-bearing trees to regenerate.